All right, we are live on the Las Vegas Tri Club Facebook page. It's Friday night, time for an evidence-based triathlete podcast, otherwise known as Two Guys Talking Triathlon.
I think it's two old guys. I think
Yeah.
it's two old guys talking triathlon.
But now we got three guys talking
Three
triathlon,
guys.
and
Yeah.
this is super cool. Jordan Rapp is joining us tonight. Hey, Jordan, how's it going?
Good, yeah. Uh,
Aw-
Strange
Awesome.
to be back in the. It's. I guess I mean I'm far enough removed now that it's like I'm no longer a triathlete in the same way that I was. So it's nice to remain in touch.
Yeah, and you have a Henderson Las Vegas connection because you've obviously raced here, and we were talking a little bit about that ahead of time. But you're also from New York.
Originally, yeah.
Yeah.
Originally, I mean, born in New York, and then we moved to lived there for a year, and then moved to California, and we're there for a year. Then moved to Japan and lived
Yeah.
there for 7 years, and then moved back to New York, like probably about 20 minutes from where we
Yeah.
originally lived, and then my parents still live in that same house.
Yeah.
Um,
That's great. Yeah, I'm originally from New York as well, upstate New York, Troy, Albany area, but
yeah.
also been down in.
My
Yeah.
parents are both New Yorkers. Like my
Oh,
dad
that's
is a
great.
city kid, and my mom is an Albany girl. So,
Oh yeah,
uh,
that's great.
yeah,
That's wonderful. So those are some neat connections, and then obviously the Ironman Canada connection, where that's actually you and I met. Although I just walked up and said hi and shook your hand because you gave the pre-race dinner presentation, and it was really a really well thought out presentation. I remember that was my wife's first Ironman, and that was just good to hear that and hear you speak and go up and say hi to you. So, and you
it
won that
feels
year too. So,
yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago. I guess in some ways it was. I mean,
uh,
you know, I
so
had
let me
one
give,
kid. Now I have four.
yeah, let me give you
I did that for a living then, and I don't do anything that even remotely
yeah,
resembles it for a living now. So.
I love it. I love it. So let me give you a sort of snapshot of your triathlon connection is, as we said, you're originally from New York City. You were a pro triathlete for at least 10 years, if not longer, right?
Yeah, I think I mean, hard to, I guess technically 12, 13 years,
Okay.
but I mean, I think, if you actually consider like count, it was closer to 10 if you count the years that I actually made a living doing it. Like
Yeah.
the first couple of years, it was like, I'm a pro, but that doesn't really mean anything in triathlon, right? It's an
I love.
elite, I guess, or whatever it is.
Well, and you came here to Las Vegas and you won the ITU long course Ironman World Championship.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was pretty cool because the ITU long distance race world championships is typically more European. So when they had it in 2011, like I knew I wanted to do it because it hadn't been in the US since 1995 or 96 when it was in Cleveland.
Hmm.
And then they announced it was going to be in the US. And I thought like it'll probably never be
Oh,
in the US
oh,
again. They ended up actually having it in the US again a couple of years later, but like ITU has sort of changed it. Like it
hmm.
was part of, I think, the multi-sport festival thing. And it was like in Tulsa. I want to say it was in Tulsa in like
Yep.
2016 or something like that.
Okay.
But I mean, it wouldn't have been a course that suited me the way that I really liked the Henderson course. And
No.
I was surprised when they had it in Tulsa so soon after having it in
Mm.
Las Vegas, because it really is it's a much bigger deal in Europe. And then of course
Mhm.
they brought it to Penticton
Yeah.
in 2017.
Yeah.
And I thought about doing that, but it's interesting because they did not choose the course. I will say this, they did not choose the course that I would have chosen
Mm.
for the race, given what they had available to them. It was especially the bike course was not what like if you've raced Ironman Canada, like, and then you think like, okay, you need to basically do 3/4 of that distance, like,
Hmm.
or sorry, 2/3 of the distance. Like, where would you go? And then what they chose, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
it was it was, I mean, when you think about sort of mountainous, and they had initially talked about making a very difficult course that I thought I might go back for, but then when they announced the course, I was like, I don't think that's for me.
Well, maybe which would have been the old Silverman course, or part of the Silverman course here was too hard for everyone, and they wanted to do something different. So that's great. So you went on and you won 6 Ironman races, including Mount Tremblant, Arizona, Texas, Canada that we're speaking of, and then the New York City one, which only happened the one time, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think the New York City one, races, I mean, the race business, like you think like, oh, they make a lot of money. Like the race business is like grocery stores, like razor thin margins.
Yeah.
And New York City permits are just super expensive. And so I think the race in New York City was already more than what Ironman was at the time. I think like it was $1,200, and then
Yeah.
they needed to raise the price even more to even, and I think it was a bit, I think there was some disappointing, like the finish line was in Riverside Park, which has a noise curfew of 10 p.m. So like they couldn't sort of have the last 2 hours when people are sort of coming in, right? It was like very muted.
Yeah.
And I think it was too bad. I think that like when you think of something like the New York City Marathon, right? But then you think, that's like what I mean, I think it's over 30,000 people now.
Yeah.
And you think like that's the scale that you need. And so, I mean, even the fact that they were able to shut down the Palisades Parkway and what they were able to shut down in the city and stuff, and to run us across the George Washington Bridge was like really crazy. I don't think people appreciated
Yeah.
that for like 2,000 athletes, like what they actually got. But yeah, I think they needed to charge a lot to deliver an experience that was not quite, I think, what maybe some athletes were hoping for when they think of like New York City. I mean, you look at the actual New York City triathlon, which is much more like you run in Central Park and like all of that kind of stuff. But that race is now like 10,000 people, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's starting to get to the point where it justifies the, for the city, the head, that head count is enough to kind of make a difference. But, Ironman, I think it was always going to be tough, but they're finally bringing a race back to New York, a better venue, I think, with Jones Beach.
Yeah.
Going out onto Long Island probably makes way more sense than it does to try and, come in from the north. But,
Yeah.
I was glad to see that, New York was getting another race, because certainly it's a hotbed of triathlon. So
It is, and that's I did some racing on Long Island, and that's going to be a good fast course. That'll be a lot of fun.
yeah, some of my first races were Long Island. I mean, there's some like very, very old, like 30-plus-year-old races out there. Mighty Hamptons, Mighty Montauk.
Yep.
Those are like, these are iconic. I mean, these are races that like Mark Allen and stuff used to do a lot.
Yeah.
They used to be like quite big when sort of short course and like the Bud Light series, right? But
Oh,
like,
yeah.
so you actually look at some of these, like there's like little nothing races out on Long Island, and some like major
Yeah.
serious athletes have won them, back in the 90s and stuff like that. So Long Island has an awesome history. So it's nice to see, sort of going out and getting some more races in there.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, no, that's great. And so some people may know you from triathlon, but they may also know you from Slow Twitch as Rap Star and sort of, that voice of reason many times. So
Yeah, I
that,
mean, and it's been, I'm still, I manage the site
yeah,
technically, but certainly spend not so much time on the forum anymore.
yeah,
But when I was racing, I spent a lot of time on there.
yeah,
Um,
it
but it's
can draw
interesting. I mean,
in.
it's like, it's crazy to think. I don't think there's a lot of websites that have been around for 20+ years.
Especially that format where
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
feel free to like just talk and beat each other up and have, in my opinion, like good conversation, right? Like for the most part. I mean,
I mean, it's not to, certainly Facebook has taken a lot of, it has taken a big chunk out of the traffic. Like if you compare sort of the before Facebook was a Facebook now, right? What how many billions of users? I mean, many more conversations happen on Facebook that used to happen on Slow Twitch. But I think it still is a testament to the site that as many conversations happen there as do happen, given that people are mostly on Facebook, right? On, all that kind of stuff. So,
but I have to say, when I started in triathlon, it was like 13 years ago. I used Slow Twitch to help me,
Mhm.
right? Like I researched things on Slow Twitch. Like, how do I get faster? Like, how do I train better? What do I do? Like, how do I improve my swimming? How do I improve my bike? And it was Slow Twitch was my resource especially in the beginning. And I still think it can be that for people.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a huge repository. I would love, I think it'd be nice to have a more advanced indexing and search. Although Google is so good at crawling that you can actually just like, if you just search Google and you put in the word slowtwitch.com, like you'll kind of get it. And our search is not bad. Like it uses a pretty like reliable, good open source search engine called Solar. That works. I mean, it's not Google, but it works actually quite well. So, I
No,
think
I like
keep
it,
it as
and
there.
I also like the forum, the buy and sell forum. I've bought wheels and components, and it's been really good for me in that regard as well. I just feel like there's a more of a level of trust on Slow Twitch than on like the Facebook Marketplace. To me,
Yeah, I mean, I think the classifieds, I think there's more that, we could do to make it, to steer people to it, because I do think there is a bit more trust. And yeah, I mean, in the history of the site, the number of sort of complaints it's very low,
yeah,
for being a marketplace, right? I think
yeah.
it's generally pretty good. So
I thoroughly enjoy it, and I enjoy the articles too. Okay, so let's delve into a few things. Number one, I did the ITU race in Penticton, and it was all I could handle. I'm just saying. So the fact it wasn't hard enough for you kind of is an interesting one. But secondarily to that, you are now racing bikes, and you're doing track cycling, correct?
yeah, so I mean, track cycling is interesting because I do the pursuit, so it's not really
Right.
like racing bikes. Because I think when people think of racing bikes, right, it's like
Right.
you are racing bikes next to each other. And I still like,
But, but you're still racing bikes. And what I was getting at was you went from being one of the, in my opinion, one of the best pro triathletes in the world to now you're an age grouper technically, right? Because
yes,
you're not a pro doing pursuit, are you?
no.
Right. So how is that switch been,
Mhm.
switching from being this elite athlete in triathlon to being an age grouper, basically?
I mean, I think it's good in the sense that I don't feel like I have anything to prove on the track, right? Like there's no, oh, I need to win this, like for some sense of validation. Like I do it because I enjoy it, right? Oh, and then in some cases, right, like I don't do it because I don't feel some compulsion to, like I really like, if I didn't live somewhere that had a world-class track like very close, I essentially would not do it, because like
Got it.
I can't imagine like, oh, I'm gonna fly with my bike, right? Like I have flown with my bike enough for several lifetimes. But I think it does, I think accessibility is a huge, like it's very hard. I think if you like, training is hard. So if getting to your training is also hard, then it becomes that much harder, where you're like, if you have to really like motivate yourself simply to get to the place where you then need to motivate yourself to do the thing, that's a lot to ask for. And so I think, certainly a big part of getting into track cycling was that when I was working at Zwift, like the track was literally on my way to the office. And it's like, it's there. I mean, I don't go as much as I used to, because now it's not on my commute, right? So now I actually have to sort of go down just to do that and then come home. It's nice that, usually I just bring my laptop, and so I'll go down and then I'll work a bit and then come home. So I don't feel like I'm just driving and then, like spending basically 3 hours. But it's certainly, I go less as a result of the fact that it's now basically a 3 hour round trip. Plus, I mean,
That's a long way to go.
just the driving, right, is 3 hours total. And that's, so I go less than I did when it was basically an additional 10 minutes, right? 5 minutes either way off my route. And I think that is, so in that sense, right, I think that it does speak a lot to like the age grouper mentality of like, I just want to do the thing. It's like, even when people say like, do I swim? And I say, no, because like I can run out my front door, I can ride out my front door. Like, why am I going to spend like 15 minutes
you know.
Like I actually live very close to a pool too. Like I literally live a mile and a half away from the pool.
Oh, then there's not that much excuse.
But like it's still right. You got to drive. You got to get changed. You got to then
Yeah.
like swimming takes more time,
You're right.
right? Whereas like the whole like getting changed, even just yeah. I mean, it doesn't take very long to drive. Like it's 5 minutes for me to get to the pool, but it's still right. That's by the time you park, you get out, right? I think why would I want to give up that? Why do I want to spend that time when I could just run instead? It's sort of like that's my thinking.
Well, I'll say as a swimmer primarily getting into triathlon, I still love swimming, and so I'll do that 10-minute drive. But I know exactly what you mean, and I've got my transition times down because I practice getting changed quickly and jumping in the pool.
Yeah, but I think that it is, and I think it certainly is one of the things that I think when people think about how they train and all of that,
Mhm.
that your training, it should be easy in certain ways, right? And I think like that's something like Zwift, a lot of it is like, it's just, yeah, it makes it easier to train, which is a good thing, it makes it that
Well,
it's
and
accessibility of training, right, is a huge.
yeah. And Ted and I have talked about this a lot, is that we both commute to work on our bike when we're, most of the time when we go in. But at the same time, we also have gotten a little soft over the years, and we've, 40 degrees, Fahrenheit is chilly for us. And so we do tend to ride inside more so than outside, especially during this time of year. And that was, a neat connection with you again with the, working at Zwift. And Ted is a Zwift expert, and I use Zwift, but Ted knows quite a bit about
I
it.
was a beta user,
Uh,
a beta tester, when it originally came out. So yeah, I've been using it ever since. And John's completely right. Like there's many days where we could ride outside here, which we used to, which we choose not to. And for me, it's because of the advent of Zwift. And it's really opened it up, time wise too, right? Like my bike is 2 feet from me. I don't have to put on a bunch of clothes and there's no stoplights. It's made training more accessible for me for sure. And I think for a lot of other triathletes, I mean, I think that it's been a really an interesting thing in triathlon. I think biking has gotten better in triathlon on the age group scene because of Zwift.
Yeah,
Or-
I mean, indoor riding, I mean, the idea that like you suffer enough like when you like in training that you shouldn't need to sort of suffer to like do the training, right? In terms of, I you make it easy on yourself to do good work, right? Whether, and if that means treadmill, if it means riding inside, whatever it is, right? I think training it shouldn't be a huge burden to sort of do it. Like if you can find a way to get it done and that's easier, then you can put more of that energy into actually training.
For me, like a long ride in the winter on Zwift, if I get into a group ride, it just goes so much quicker. People are chit-chatting, there's scenery going by, it's 2 or 3 hours on Zwift is way easier than 2 or 3 hours like on the old school rollers, by myself in my own head. Even if I'm watching TV, it's not the same. And that interactivity is a big part of it. I'd like to add one other thing. It's my understanding that you were one of the impetuses behind doing the Alp to Zwift.
I mean, I wouldn't say that. Like I did, like there was a big group of us. Like I was a part of the team that helped deliver it as it exists.
Because I love that course. That's all I'm just gonna tell you. Like,
Yeah. So I mean, like I worked with the design. Like there was a group of probably 4 of us that did the design of like the mini map with the segments, and then like I think the only thing where you could say like I did it myself was the grading of the segments, the color coding.
okay.
It's my opinion of what they should be. So like the yellow, orange, red grading is, but other than that, it was all like a huge effort. But that was the only thing where it was sort of like, they were just like, okay, you grade the climbs,
But
the segments.
like that was like one of the things that almost shifted Zwift to me. It's like, okay, this is real, you know, like we're going up the same climb that's in France.
Mhm.
And, you know, and seeing people do it on Zwift and then do it in France, and their times were basically the same. Power was, you know, basically the same on the climb. I'm like, okay, this is real. Like this is, and to me that was super cool. And you know, one of the biggest kind of, I don't know, switches for me in the world of Zwift. So even if you're a small part of that or part of the team, I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was really fun. Like I remember I had to be super careful because I was riding it a lot to sort of make sure that it was all felt good and everything like that. And I had to be really careful to not let the Strava files
Oh yeah,
leak.
get out. Yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
for sure.
Um,
Because they
but
do, sometimes they get leaked out, don't they?
yeah, yeah. So I had to make sure that my Strava was all private during that time, you know.
And you still race on Zwift as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I race actually with the like the Zwift headquarters team still. Just
Mhm.
there's like I've been racing with that same team for so long that they were like, even when I left the company, they kept me on the team, so that was nice.
That's,
But
well, maybe because you're a little bit of a ringer.
although I mean, it's a very like I race on the you know our A category team is quite competitive.
Your B category team is quite competitive too. I'm in the same league as Eric Min.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, I know that like there's good cyclists at the company,
They're
so
good. They're
yeah. Like I think
they're winning our league.
oh yeah, I mean, this is our best showing in the A category so far. Like we are in second. I don't think we have a chance to take first, but I think we'll finish. I think if we have a good race in the next one, which is the last in this 6-race series, that we'll finish second, which I think is the highest finish that we've had as a team, which is quite good. I do think I don't love the scoring system. I wish they had more scratch races. Like it's very intermediate points heavy, and like you get a lot of points. Like it feels like double dipping, where it's like, oh, you get first across the line and fastest time for segment,
Yep.
and then like the actual finish points is like the same as that. I think that they should, the fastest time for segment, especially, it feels to me like I don't like, how do you gauge that? And it doesn't, it's a weird thing to like, you can't really sort of, it doesn't to me make sense. Like if I was to design the scoring for it, like I would keep the first across the line exactly the way it is. I would eliminate entirely the fastest time for segment, and I would and then I would just double the finish points. So get rid of
I couldn't agree more.
I'd get rid of the finish time, fastest time per segment points, and then just double. And I think that would be good, right? I think we would be much closer. Like I think we still might be in second, but I think it would be much tighter and much more representative. Like we've actually won, like in terms of like being first across the line. We have won 4 of 5 races, and yet like we're in second. And I'm like, I don't understand how that works when we've, yeah, I mean, so I think, but you see from the points how it works. And that's where I was sort of thinking like, it doesn't, yeah.
Well, you know, so for those of you that don't know, we're talking about the Zwift Racing League, and it's pretty much, it's the premier racing league, you know, in esports as far as like cycling is concerned, in my opinion. And I agree with you. One of the ideas behind the Zwift Racing League was to create teams and have camaraderie, right? But when we have all these segments, it blows the teams up, and so you don't really have as much chance to work as a team together. So that's, at least that's what we're finding in our league is
Although the team time trial, which is definitely the coolest,
it
I
is
would
the
say
coolest.
it's the coolest new feature since I have seen
Yeah.
in like that, where I was like, oh, I didn't know anything about that, right? Like they just did it, and I was like, this is amazing, right? Sort of every other feature that came, like you know, I was there for 3 years, and so I saw the stuff that, you know, we delivered, right? And then there was a bunch of stuff that they sort of came out, but I was like, well, we actually had, like, we had started that when I was still there, but this was the first thing where it was like, I mean, like was the part of the group that where we did the actual like the time trial thing.
Mhm.
But the whole like team concept, and then like how that all works, and then drafting on time trial bikes, everything about it. Yeah, no, I mean, it's super fun, and I love that. And actually our team, like we have 2 quite good time trialists between myself and another guy, and then some other guys that are also pretty good. And we've won both of the team time trials in our league. But yeah, I mean, it's super it's super racing, and something that I think, no one would ever get to experience that outside of Zwift. Whereas like you probably like there are still local crits and things like that, but like there's no way that you would ever get to do a team time trial without Zwift.
And
So-
and the team time trial, one last thing is and also super cool because everyone talks to each other. So we're on Discord.
Same.
And so you get to know each other, right? Where in the scratch races, you're just breathing so damn hard all the time. It's hard to actually, get to know each other. And there's even like, people may not know this, but you can have a team car. So you can have a director basically coaching you along the way and telling you about the gaps. And
Yep, we have that.
it's so like it's you're right, like the average person is never going to be in a situation where they basically have a race radio like that happens in like professional cycling.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's to me that it's a super platform.
So the other part of this, and this is one of the other reasons why I reached out to you, is the ethics that we're starting to see in electronic racing like this. I guess I refer to it as mechanical doping, but maybe that's not the same thing when we're looking at gamification of cycling. And I've seen some of the information you've put out on identifying people who are cheating in racing like this. So talk a little bit about the cheating, maybe some things that that we see people doing in Zwift racing or any of these types of electronic races like this that are
Yeah, so I think it was like March, February of 2018 was the first time that they wanted to have the Zwift National Championships, which was the first. It was the first time that Zwift itself had ever wanted to sanction and sort of put on like major races, right? Before that, but lots of racing on Zwift, but it was just community. There were no sort of official Zwift races, right? And there was certainly there was no actual prize. Whereas in this case, right, there was like the digital champions jersey and that sort of stuff. And they actually were working with federations and all of that type of thing. And so, but I think it was very much done like with like this will be great. And then I remember at the end of it, there was quite a bit of like, you knew there was going to be cheating, but I didn't think it was going to be quite as bad. And there was a bunch of stuff that happened that sort of, I think, really exposed that, like you really need to treat this like in a very formal way. Like there was some of it was rules, right? Like basically, like the ultimate sort of manifestation was that a man from Florida won the Swiss women's national championship. Because technically, according to the rules as they were written at the time, right, his avatar had a Swiss flag and was registered as a female. And so like that was basically, and the rules, like according to the rules, that was all that was required. And so there were some other cases where like there were some other cases that were sort of maybe on the fence that where you're like, oh, I don't know about this, but like it was really not. It was for all the good it was. Like I think being on the other side of it, it was not something where I thought like this is not what you would want to repeat, right? I think growing pains, all of that kind of stuff. I think it was fine for the first, but I think it was clear that we needed to treat it much more seriously. And so there was a community organized group that was part of Zwift Power called Zada, right? Sort of a play on the WADA thing. And it was a very accomplished group of sports scientists, but they ended up disbanding because a bunch of Zwift Power users basically were threatening them with lawsuits. And so I reached out to some of them. I was like, hey, what if basically Zwift, like, what if we were like, you have a lawyer, you have Zwift's lawyer, would you come back and do the work? And they said, of course, right? And so Bjorn Asenbrink who is a incredibly well-regarded exercise physiologist from Canada, and then he has brought in these guys are amazing. The tools that they've built, they've done heavy customization of Golden Cheetah, which is their analysis tool that they use, but a lot of other things. And I mean, I would say that in many ways, like they it is amazing when you actually see the difference between racing, like the level of racing when people know that like Zada is not going to check their data, and then when they know, it's like wow, like people suddenly like lost a watt per kilo. Funny the way that works. No, I mean, I think they have done an extraordinary job since and so basically so essentially after the 2018 spoke to them, and then they came on board, and 2019 was basically the first. It was essentially Zada was back, you know, an actual, we had an actual rule book. Zada was doing enforcement, and I think the 2019 really set the standard for what we now think of as sort of really official Zwift esports, right? Like I think the 2018 edition, there's no way you ever could have had a UCI World Championships with that as the template, right? But then the 2019 edition was very much like, oh yeah, like this is a real cycling discipline now. And I think it was a testament to Zwift to basically to provide the legal support and to basically say like, no, like if someone says they're going to sue you, like they're basically suing us. We will cover you in terms of liability. You know, and you know, there was basically, and so like when I was racing with Ironman, I was the liaison to WADA. And so had a lot of connections with traditional anti-doping. And so we ended up actually, and again, you know, so put so I don't, do you know who Richard McLaren is?
I do not know.
Oh, so like, I mean, like this is basically like original sort of director, like one of the founder, the whole story of how like WADA was founded, I will get wrong because I'm a little bit removed from it, but basically like the whole like investigation into Russian doping and all of that stuff, like the McLaren, like that was Richard McLaren, right? So he actually ran WADA for I think a decade. And I mean, is incredible sort of, he is a lawyer himself, but sort of very much a sports lawyer. And so I didn't know Richard directly, but had worked with what's called the McLaren Sports Group, which is basically like the group that manages Ironman's anti-doping, not like the policy, and then in particular, if somebody challenges, right, and is going to go to like CAS, like who actually like handles the case with CAS, and that's like what the McLaren Sports Group, which is based out of Toronto, like they do that, and they do a lot of, they write anti-doping policies and stuff like that. And actually, so we had them write Zwift's anti-doping policy, and it covered, right, mostly covering sort of basically the policy was traditional doping is the province of your federation. Like Zwift is not interested in basically touching this, but all of the mechanical and technological sort of ways that you could cheat, right? That whole policy was written by McLaren, you know, and so it's very sort of well put together, and it, you know, it's very much sort of in line with any major sporting organization. So there's a really, like, I think the shift from like this kind of like, we should do national championships in 2018 to like this very, very formal approach in 2019, I think really set the stage for, you know, being able to have a UCI esports official world championship and all of that. And I think it's interesting because I think actually that at the like esports world championships, like I actually think that there's probably less cheating there than there is in a lot of in sort of equivalent like level world championship races, because the athletes, they know that their data is public, right? It's interesting. The UCI is pushing very hard on teams to have access to power meter data, and the teams are pushing quite hard back on it because they don't want it. Because of course, the UCI could totally do very, very clearly targeted like anti-doping testing if they had access to the power files, right? And so, but in Zwift, right, it's like, do you really want to do, you know, 5 minutes at 8 watts per kilo? Like, are you sure about that? Because like it then is so obvious, right? Because you have sort of two options. One is that you then get caught for mechanical doping, and it's like, well, like you basically doped your trainer, and so obviously that was flawed. But then like the secondary outcome of that is like, oh, like, no, like your trainer is accurate. like you actually did hold 8 watts per kilo for 5 minutes. Like, who's your national, like, who's your NATO again? Right?
Yep.
Because like, I guarantee you that like, if you're a US cyclist and you're holding whatever, 8, 9 watts per kilo for 5 minutes, like USADA is going to start knocking on your door with like very high regularity. And so I think the data forces this level of transparency. And it's interesting. I think is it Michael Ashenden, who's like the exercise physiologist, the one who sort of got a little bit of hot water, I think, wrote a bunch of stuff about when Lance Armstrong published his, and I think he came out and was like, there's evidence, and then it's not clear. He, I think, is a little bit more or was outspoken than probably should have been, like saying things. But in any case, I think it was Ashton who wrote this very interesting paper basically saying that like the critical power model, it should be the actual like standard for targeted anti-doping. And that paper and that sort of is really a lot of the foundation essentially of Zwift's anti-cheating policy. And it's very, very good, right? Like those guys, they've developed a ton of their own models for Zwift specific sort of output. And I think they have also done a bunch of work to identify data anomalies, right? Like things like flatlining power curves that's very specific to Zwift, right? That's indication of, say, systems, what I would call systems manipulation, right? That the power, like if you're sprinting and the power doesn't change for like 3 seconds, like that's a huge red flag because there should be very high variance. And so it's not just about like the actual output, it's actually even like signal shaping and things like that. So they continue to basically really push the envelope. I don't, I wish that more of it could be public because I think it's fascinating research. But yeah, I don't sort of know what the policy is there or not. But I do know that it's, you have a very talented group of guys with very strong exercise physiology backgrounds that have really, I think one of the guys, like his brother is a systems engineer who's done a bunch of like, actually, like, let's start talking about like waveforms and things like that and starting to pick out cheating in that way. But yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. I will say that there is for sure, there's a lot more that they could do, like working on a game that has now in Apex Legends that has, massive, right? Like we just had a tournament in London with $1 million prize purse, right? And we'll have a tournament this summer with a $2 million prize purse, right? And so like the ways in which Apex handles cheating is in many ways that much actually, I mean, is in a lot of ways substantially more sophisticated, in part because there's a much bigger industry. Like Zwift is basically figuring out Zwift cheating, whereas like Apex, right, like the ways in which people cheat at traditional computer games is much more clearly known, right? Like there's a lot, and of course it's a much bigger industry, right? Like you talk about like cheating in Call of Duty, Fortnite, Apex, all of these things is like, there's massively much more dollars on the line than cheating in Zwift. And so of course there's then massively more dollars towards sort of keeping the platform integrity high. But I do think in both cases, both Zwift sort of showing the UCI and these traditional, right? Like if you were really, really serious about using like data more than just blood tests for sort of cheating detection, like you could actually be much more effective, right? And then I think the video game industry, because when people cheat in video games, it's like it can be like so obvious, right? And I think you see this starting in cycling now with like the doping with motors is, people perceive it very differently than they perceive like taking drugs, right? Because like when you're taking drugs, it's like you're still riding the bike, but like anyone's like, well, like if it's a motor, like you're not even doing the work. And I think people like have a much more, like I think there were a lot of people that are like, who cares if Lance Armstrong like took drugs? Everybody took drugs. But I don't think any of those people would be like if Lance Armstrong had used a motor, like I don't think any of those people would be like, who cares, right? He used a motor, everybody's using motors, right? Like it's because like when you're taking drugs, like at least you're still riding the bike. Like when the motor is doing the work, like that's no longer the case. And that's like the video game example, right? Like the guy where it's literally like a robot that never misses a shot. And so as a result of that, cheating on video games can like, it can totally undermine platform integrity in a way that's so obvious that is not as obvious with like, sort of EPO and that kind of stuff. But it really, like the damage to the integrity is still the same. Like when people are like, they're still riding their bike, it's like, but they're not. Like you can't actually conceive of like what it means to just be like, oh, like I did this incredibly hard workout and I now feel fine, right? Like the speed of recovery and all that stuff. And so there's a much, like, I would like to put simply, right? Like there's a much higher incentive. Like video games have to handle the cheating problems in a way that like traditional sports, like they don't. But I think what it shows you is that if you look at how seriously video games take cheating and you see what is actually like possible when you put that level of like resources into developing like strong technology to combat cheating. Like if you imagine that same investment being made in traditional sport where like, like I want to say that like WADA's operating budget is like $10 million or something like that, where you're like, wait, what?
No.
Right? Like you imagine if you were like, WADA, you have now $100 million a year, like what they could actually do to improve the integrity of sport. I think it would be massive. So I think, it's funny because people make fun of games for like video games. And I think like everyone is like, people are weight doping on Zwift. And yeah, I actually think that in many ways, Zwift takes cheating the most seriously of any discipline because they have exposure on all fronts. I used to say like, it's great. We have all of the cheating problems that video games have, and also all of the cheating problems that regular cycling has. And like, in some ways you could look at that as being like, how can you take the racing seriously? And yet at the same time, you can say that, well, these are different problems. And in some ways, it's a little bit, you can play them off against each other where it's like, fine, I'll totally believe that you are the strongest cyclist to have ever lived. Do you then want to take a blood test, right? Or on the flip side, right? It's like, so you passed a blood test. Like, how is it that you're actually saying that you are like that much faster than guys that failed all of these drug tests? And so I think, rather than being something where this level of exposure has made the platform less trustworthy, I think it's actually made it more trustworthy. And I think hopefully, that trickles down. I think it'll be very interesting to see the impact of like video games are coming to the Olympics, right? Like there's no question. And I think, certainly the Olympics likes the idea of something like Zwift because it sort of is more similar, but like you will for sure see like a traditional video game. Like I think you will see a game like Apex Legends in the Olympics within probably certainly within the next 20 years. And I would guess within the next 10, because like they need to reach an audience, right? Like Olympics has a demographic problem that is not going away. And like the transition of like X Games to Olympic Games is pretty well proven, right? Like BMX, snowboarding, rock climbing. And so like video games have been in X Games for a long time. Like they're for sure coming to the Olympics. And I think it will be interesting to see, how they sort of manage that. And I mean, and it's interesting because video games, they have this, everybody thinks about the traditional cheat, like the sort of video game traditional cheating of like, oh, you're using hack software, but like they also actually have drug problems, right? Like Adderall abuse, stimulant abuse is a problem there too. So I think video games will benefit from some of the blood testing that would come from being part of the Olympic movement. And then I think hopefully the more traditional sports would benefit from the technological focus that video game anti-cheat brings. But no, I think it's fascinating, and I love working. I mean, I work as a part of the team that handles a lot of the work to on platform integrity and stuff like that. And it's not specific to the work that I do, but I think one of the guys that, is sort of on my same team, right? Like that is his entire role is anti-cheat. And I think it's amazing to see that, right? That like we have a guy who's a very, very senior, very gifted engineer, right? And it's his sole job is to prevent people from cheating. And I think, I'm hopeful that Zwift at some point hires somebody for a similar type of role.
I'm hopeful that someone at Ironman does the same.
I mean, Ironman, Ironman has a very, they really did, it was pretty remarkable, right? Like when I think it was 2009 when they introduced, they were the first ever basically business to sort of become a part of the WADA
Right.
umbrella, right? And I think, they didn't necessarily need to do that, but I think they did it. And like, I was very closely involved with that. And I think, I have my criticisms of the WADA model for sure, but I think Ironman committed to what is the standard in international sport fully. And so I would not fault them. I think,
Well, I mean, I'll push back a little bit and say for professional racing, yes.
yeah,
For age group racing, I think it's severely lacking. And, we don't have to go very far to follow the threads on Slow Twitch and the purported numbers of age group athletes that are actually doping. And it does sully the sport. And,
yeah, no, I mean,
so I think on the pro side, most of you, I'm sure, been drug tested many times. I've raced 100 triathlons, never been tested. John's, I don't think you've ever been tested.
but I would also argue that you guys probably shouldn't be tested, right? I think targeted testing for sure makes sense. I mean, I think you could look at it as like, you should test the people that you think you're going to catch.
Agreed.
So I don't know that you, like, not having been tested is like a huge red flag. I think it's more that there are probably a lot of athletes where you're like, that person definitely should have been tested and they've never been tested.
That,
I
yeah,
think
that's more of the issue. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't, this is one of those things where it's like, I don't know what I am and not allowed to say. So all I will say is that the liability concerns are significant, right? Because triathlon is a high demographic, high income demographic, right? And so the idea that like, there's a lot of those people where like, that for sure have disposable income that like, they're like, sure, I'll fight you on this, right? Like, and like my brother is a whatever hotshot lawyer, so like I'm basically doing this for free, like, but like when McLaren comes to the table, you're talking $1,000 an hour type of lawyers, right, to combat that. And so it like this is, but WADA sort of sets this up, right? Like the system is built around the arbitration model, right? And private arbitration is very expensive, right? This is, of course, like when you think of things like non-disclosure agreements and like the Me Too, and where you'd have all these employers, right? Sort of the big blow up of like all these employers, right? Because of course, like all those NDAs also fall under arbitration, right? And the whole argument there is like, it's not fair because these employees, they can't actually bring a case because like, sure, yeah, like some massive, like, like Google, whatever, or, Activision, any of these, some billion-dollar company, like if you're like, I will challenge you on this NDA, they're like, sweet, let's go to arbitration, right? Like, who are you going to pay, right? And so, but this is the flip side, right? Because, people think like Ironman, it's massive, and it's like, Ironman is not really a very big company, right? And so if you have some age grouper that's essentially like, I got $1 million to spend fighting you, like, what is Ironman's, like, should Ironman basically say, okay, like, we will spend $1 million to fight you on this? Like, is that the best use of that $1 million, right? Like, how many drug tests then do not happen? And so I think that is the arbitration model. Traditionally, like, I think part of the reason that they set it up, right, is that like in most cases, the battle is like NGO, right? Like, let's say whatever, USA Track and Field, individual athlete. And then of course, in that case, you can see the disparity is like, are you really going to fight the NGO and like their lawyers? And so the athlete comes out on the short end of the stick. And so that's certainly the knock against the arbitration model for pro athletes is that like amateur pro athletes, meaning like, let's say Olympic swimmers, right? Like who don't have a ton of money, like that they can't afford to go to arbitration against a governing body that has lawyers on staff. But in the Ironman case, an age group athletes anyway, but certainly not pro athletes, but on age group athletes, that is inverted, where it's now like, do you really want to like pop the CEO of some Fortune 500 company who like probably doesn't want to be like busted for doping and will probably spend, a lot of money to fight that. And so I think the arbitration model starts to break down there in a way that was unexpected. And I want to be like, I will say, like, I have no knowledge of, like, I was very much on the policy side and not in the like enforcement side. So I'm not implying in any way and not saying that like, Ironman, is choosing, but I think it, like, at the end of the day, right, like these are business decisions. And if you were to say to Ironman, like, okay, like you can bust this guy, but it's going to cost you $1 million to basically like follow through on it, like, do you want to spend that money? And really, do your customers want you to spend that money, right? Do the pro athletes, where that money is getting taken out of like the pro athlete doping pool, because there's not an unlimited source. I think it's the dollars and cents, right? That's where I think that the finances of WADA are so unfortunate, right? Is that the finances of anti-doping are a much more substantial piece of the puzzle than anyone would ever have you believe, and it's never discussed, right? Like,
so Jordan, I know we're going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but so then, I mean, if you were in charge of like age group racing, triathlon, cycling, whatever, how do we ensure that it's relatively drug free?
So there's a challenge in that the floor, the cost floor is currently very high. So like this is like to do a complete urine profile is like, that test is about $500, right? And a blood test is about $1,000, right? Like the exact sort of doesn't matter, right? And so that is a very hard number to get around. But the question is like, do you actually need to run the depth of analysis that they run? And the answer, and so this is where I think you start to get into like murky stuff, right? And so right now, essentially, the WADA policy is basically you must be sort of statistically like absolutely certain, right? Like there has to be like essentially 99.9% certainty that like the positive is correct. And I am not sure that that's actually like productive. And people are like, but look, if you bust an innocent athlete, like you ruin their career. And I'm like really, Alexander Vinokurov, like, like let's just name all of the pro cyclists, right? And like that sort of like, I was like, I don't actually think that like this is a career ending decision. Like I'm in fact, right, like Justin Gatlin.
Yep.
Like let's be clear that like failing a drug test is not actually and so it doesn't really scare sponsors away in the way that some athletes. And so I think like the thing that I argued is like, okay, what if you lowered the threshold to 90%? And there's interesting research, like there has been research out there that basically they showed that for like microdosing EPO, if you at the 99.9% threshold, essentially you catch like, I think it was, I'd have to go dig it up, but it was either they caught nobody or they caught like 1 in like 20. And they were like you should definitely catch these guys, right? And when they lowered it to 90%, it was like close to 100% catch rate. But of course, and people are like, well, what about the false positives? And I'm like, yes, that's true. But I think it's at least worth having the discussion of, okay, right now we're at 99.9% in 4 years. What if we lowered it to 90% in 6 months? Like,
Yeah.
like I feel like right now it's like essentially we know from a lot of the sort of studies and unofficial, right? It's like that, like track and field, I think they estimate the doping rate is somewhere between like 30 to 40% of athletes, and they catch, and typical catch rates are somewhere between 1 and 3%. I think weightlifting is like the highest, where they catch like, they've got like 3% of all tests come back positive, and you're like, sweet. Like the sport where it's like literally like all you need to do is take drugs and you'll be like better at it. Like they catch like 3%, and in most sports it's about 1 to 1.5%. Where it's like, yeah, okay, like you actually have to still be good. Like you can't just take drugs. And so we know that like the testing is not effective. And so like, and yet it's like, let's just keep doing the same thing, right? Like, let's, and I'm like, I feel like there should at least be more discussion of what if we actually just like rethought this of lower the threshold and lower the penalty. And it's like, would I have wanted to been the guy that got popped on a false positive? Like, of course not. But I don't know. Like, people are like, imagine, like you said, and I'm like, this is not like the real court thing, right? Like, you're not going to jail. Like, it is not as severe. And so I think it's at least worth considering. I think it's interesting to see some of the proposals for some alternative like metrics, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if you follow that the bio passport basically got thrown out.
Yeah.
Right. And so they're like, yeah,
which was a shame, because I think it was a good idea.
Yeah. Right. And so I think the question is like, and I think a little bit I don't know that there's any impetus to replace it, but like, I think to me, especially with the advent of a lot of like, that all of these athletes, right, they're collecting massive amounts of data. And so I think there should really be the idea at Zwift, we call it a data passport, and that's like that's what they track. But I think you can expand that, right? I think data passports have a lot of validity as and the data is not just blood, right? I think.
No, I completely agree. If you have an athlete that is, let's say we have their data and they're a 50-year-old age grouper that's putting out 350 watts for an hour, like this is not physiologically a normal thing. And we look back, last year they did 270 or 280. Well, this is a red flag, right? Because this is not within physiologic norms as we know them in exercise physiology. Mm-hmm. And we don't need to blood test you for that, or we can target the blood test to you because, it appears as though something is not right. And I think that might be the model that we need to go for in triathlon is looking at these anomalies and based off of historic information.
I mean, I think it's worth having a discussion around something other than basically like, let's just keep going with blood and urine mass spectrometry for another 20 years. Right. I'm like, I don't know, like that. So, I mean, I'm excited. I think esports is a very clear opportunity to rethink that, because like the data is not optional, right? Like the data is like the event is data is the event, right? Like, so it's necessary. And so I think, that might be the thing that causes a shift. But
well, I would be happy if it did, because like you said, the model is being built, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to, take the top 10 people at Kona and say, we were going to look at your data for the last 5 years. You have to have this amount of data or 4 years or whatever the case may be. And, that might just, or we can look at your data, right? Not even do it, just say we can. And ultimately what happens with that? Because you're right, it's not economically feasible to charge $500 or to do $500 testing on age groupers.
Yeah, and I mean, some of it is also though, if you run fewer tests.
Yep.
Like the WADA, I mean, and this starts to get into like the very right, is that the WADA band list is much too long, right? And people are like, oh, but like, I mean, and I will say, like, some of the research that puts some of those substances on there is very shoddy, right? It's like finasteride, which is the like balding medicine. So
Propecia.
Zach Lunds, right, who is the skeleton racer who basically missed out on the Olympic team, right, because they added, Propecia finasteride, right? Like they added it to the ban list, and then on him, and he says this, right? Like I missed it getting added, right? And then but I think like literally they used one paper that had, I think like it was either like 6 or 10 subjects.
Yep.
And they were like, based on this, we're concluding that it's a masking agent. And I was like, really? And then, of course, and then a year later, they ended up taking it off. But like, and I'm not saying like masking agents are important to test for, but like the whole marijuana testing, right? Like, I mean, if you look at the ban list, I mean, it is massive. And it's like, yes, some of these things are very bad. And I get that like masking agents are a problem and all of that. But at the same time, like how much, like if you ran a blood and urine test for basically like, like testosterone biomarkers, and then I think like the EPO urine test is very expensive. But I think, like
But
again, if you put more,
if you just put testosterone and just testosterone metabolites.
yeah, exactly.
And
Right.
that's
So
all you measured.
yeah, like how much cheaper would that, like, does that change the test from $500 to $50? Right. And so I think, simplifying the band list certainly would go a long way. Also not requiring sort of that 99 where you need like these very, very expensive machines.
Yeah.
I think would also, I think it is like, I can't imagine that we don't have WADA, right? Like that you don't have that group, right? Like I can't imagine a world in which WADA is not there. I think there is no question that they have had a massively positive impact, and yet I think it is also very representative of sports bureaucracy and the negatives that come along with that. And I think it would be nice to see some of those things maybe be revisited, especially I think as this definition of sport, right, is changing, and I think that data is meaning more and more things. And I think you have more sophisticated tools for analyzing and sort of making sense of that data. But yeah, I mean, I think, Ashenden made a very compelling case, right? And it basically says like critical power, like forget blood tests, right? Like just look at people's power data.
No, it's completely true. So, Jordan, this has been absolutely amazing and fascinating, and I'm just loving this conversation so much. But we did tell you we're going to keep this to about an hour. So, first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on. This has been great. I actually teach a sports pharmacology class, so I'm going to be using some of this information in my class. But yeah, this has been fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I think it's interesting to see. I think I would like to see more involvement from university professors that are sort of at this intersection, right? Like I did a talk with Steven Seiler, right, who's now teaching as part of like, they actually have an esports. There's a major at the university in Norway that he teaches at, right, in esports. I think esports, like I was a little bit like, wait, like you watch people play video games, and then COVID hit and I started watching people play video games. And I'm like, this is good entertainment, right? And now being a part of, a very major esports franchise with Apex Legends, I'm like, esports is amazing, right? Like it is just fascinating. And I think I am super excited to see what it brings to more traditional sport.
I actually, Jordan, I moderated a talk at the National Athletic Trainers Association meeting this summer on injuries and treating injuries to esport athletes. And
yeah, carpal tunnel. I mean, carpal tunnel is a big one. I mean,
but that's not the only, all the postural things,
yeah,
neck issues and shoulder problems and upper cross syndrome that we think of like for swimmers is happening in these esport I call them athletes. They're athletes, right?
Yeah, I mean, and most of the really big organizations, they now have personal trainers and chefs. I mean, it's funny. I remember actually racing in Dallas, and they had an esports in like 2006 at the Dallas US. I think it was 2006. Might have been it was around that time, 2006, 2007. And they had like an esports convention. It was like just like like, monster energy everywhere, right? Like, like smoking, and like, you were like, these people are not athletes, right? And like, you compare that to now where it's like, they have like nutrition coaches, right? And then like mental focus coaches, and you're like, oh yeah, like they're for sure athletes, right? I mean, the physical skill component of that is extremely high. It's very specialized, but I mean, is it any less specialized? I mean, archery, riflery, shooting, right? Are, very much the same. So yeah, I think it's super fascinating, and
Yeah,
the physiology of esports is especially interesting.
we've connected with some pro esport teams here in Las Vegas, and you're spot on. I mean, there's training centers now that are dedicated to these athletes or these competitors. It's really amazing. Jordan, this has been fascinating. And, Ted and I have talked about doing more about doping and cheating in sport. And we did one podcast earlier, but this is by far, we just sort of stumbled on this with you here, and this has just been really insightful. And the level of knowledge that you have in this area is just tremendous to share. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel lucky to have been exposed to like the real workings of it, right? And I think, I at the end of the day, right, I just wish WADA had more money. I think there is so much that
Mhm.
that
We need the
really is just,
benefactor.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is, I think when you say like, how seriously does the IOC take doping, right? It's like, if they really took it seriously, like WADA would have the kind of budget that like the, film and media and production crews have, right? Like, you put your money where your mouth is. So I think,
Well, after we hang up from our call, I'm gonna keep you on and ask you how I can cheat on Zwift and win my races. So I appreciate that.
yeah, I could tell you there are lots, there are ways. I mean,
Can I
but
put my wife's e-bike on my trainer?
I mean, you can, but I will say that the interesting thing about e-bikes, because it's a feedback control, it's very, very obvious in the power profile, because it basically, it overcorrects and undercorrects, right? Because it's trying to normalize. And so I don't know if it was ever for sure. Like, I will say that there were definitely cases where we looked at power profiles, and all of us looking were like, that person is definitely using an e-bike, because you
Dang
can
it.
see basically, like, because it's a typical like sort of over damped system, right? Like, it overcorrects and it undercorrects, and so you see basically this, you can see this sort of shrinking sine wave, and you're like, that's, yeah.
Well, so I love this because on one hand, there's a normalization of cheating. I know we want to wrap up here, but because we search for cheat codes for games, and so there's always that way. Maybe we end on a different note where what words would you give to the honest athlete who is not going down that temptation to cheat either in Zwift or in racing?
I
When
mean, I
you're
think
stuck
what
that
I
way.
would say is, I think that the racing, like, there is cheating on Zwift, but I think the racing is in general fair, right? Like, I think I have won my fair share of races. I think especially in the leagues, like Zwift Power has some pretty good automated tools, to flag people and stuff like that. You can do a lot when you have data. You really can. And so I think, you know, I would say, don't let don't believe that everyone is sort of cheating on Zwift and you have no chance. Like, the racing is fair, and you know it's at least as fair as, like, whatever, right? Like it's just as fair, like when you're going to your local crit, and the guy might be like going to like the local, like, do you have low testosterone, right? I mean, so I mean, whatever. But I think the racing is fair and it's super fun. Don't let that dissuade you, I think.
Love it.
Yeah.
That's great. Jordan, thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All
All
right.
right. Well, that was another episode. We're through another Friday. John, I hope you have a good weekend. Jordan, I hope you have a good weekend.
Thank you so
Keep
much.
the rubber side down.
Easy on
And
Zwift to keep. I mean, I do like that about Zwift. No
it's
crashing.
easy on Zwift. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone.